But it was confirmation for me, and that was that I was built for Alaska. I look really, really good in a flannel. Right, Mandy? Yep. I have a nice little extra layer of, let's call it, insulation. And God bless me with this beard. And everything about that just screams Alaskan mountain man. So that was really good for me. But it was kind of a double bucket list cross-off for me because we actually got to go to Alaska by going on a cruise. And I had wanted to do a cruise really since the concept of a cruise was introduced to me as a kid. I mean, something about traveling on the open sea just kind of appealed to the part of that little boy that wanted to grow up to be a pirate. But also, just once somebody told me that you are within feet of an all-you-can-eat buffet at all times, let's go. But for the longest time, and the reason why it took so many years for us to finally be able to cross that particular part of the bucket list off for me, was because as excited as I was to go on a cruise, my beautiful wife was very reluctant to do so. Something about being out on the open sea just made her really, really nervous. I think that maybe as a kid, she watched Titanic far too many times. And so just the idea of being out there was just nerve-wracking for her. And so she also was concerned about the sanitary conditions of a few thousand people sharing a very enclosed space. And let's be honest, over the last 5 years, she may have had a point there. But I think the biggest thing for her, I think the biggest part that made her reluctant to go on to this cruise was that she was genuinely concerned about seasickness. See, neither of us had ever really spent any significant time on a boat before, and so we didn't really know if that was something that we needed to worry about. I mean, we'd had the occasional family vacations where we'd rent a motorboat or something like that, and that, but you're really only on the water for like maybe an hour, hour and a half before the motorboat kind of loses its luster. I was never one to do water skiing. Sounds painful. But we'd never been on the boat for a long stretch of time, and so we didn't know, is this something that we genuinely need to be concerned with? And so she was just kind of nervous about the notion of spending an entire vacation just being sick the whole time. And I think that's a genuine concern for everything. And it really wasn't until some very good friends of ours went on a cruise and were raving about how awesome it was and were able to answer all the questions that she had that finally she was willing to relent and let me cross that off the bucket list. Now, why she was willing to listen to them instead of me, that's a whole other issue we need to work through. But when Mandy finally cracked that armor and she was willing to let us go and do this sort of thing, and after we bought the non-refundable tickets, which I'm still convinced is the only reason I was allowed to go on this particular vacation, we did what millennials do, right? We went on YouTube and we were looking up like different videos on how to do a cruise right, but certainly some of those videos had to include what to do if you feel you're getting seasick. And we kind of learned through watching those videos that there's really only one cure for seasickness, and it's not a pill. It's not Dramamine. It's not any sort of breathing. Feel those sensations of dizziness or nausea. The best thing to do is to try to find something that is not moving and stare at that. To give that your complete and utter focus to make sure that you do not move your eyes off of this one thing that is not moving. And that as you do that over the next few moments, you'll begin to feel those sensations of dizziness and nausea will decrease significantly so. That is the best way for you to get through that experience, is to find a focal point and give it all of your attention. And really that is advice that is beneficial to us throughout our lives, is it not? Each one of us, we have different things that we make a focal point in our lives. Maybe for you, your focal point is your family. And so you do everything that you can for them. You give them as much attention as you possibly can. You seek to make their lives better. You invest in your kids. You make sure that your spouse knows that you love them, that you care about them. You're concerned about the well-being of your parents. You do everything that you can to make your family your focal point. Maybe for you, it's your career. Maybe for you, your career is kind of your focal point. You want to climb that corporate ladder, or you want to build that business from the ground up, or you want to make whatever you're doing as best as you possibly can. And so you give that as much attention as you possibly can. Maybe for you, that focal point is something else entirely. Let's be honest. Oftentimes, that focal point can be on something that it really shouldn't be on. Right? I don't know about you, but I've been guilty of making my focal point something that it really shouldn't have been, something that really was kind of a waste of my time, and yet I found myself investing so much time and effort and energy and sometimes money. And it wasn't until much later that I recognized that the thing that I was so focused on was something that I should not have been. Maybe for some of you that poor focal point was politics, or maybe a specific politician. Whether for good or bad, you made that individual your focal point. Whether it was you loved everything that they had to say or you hated everything they had to say, they became your focal point, but it wasn't until later you realized you probably shouldn't have made them that. Maybe for you that focal point was social media and the toxicity that can be. And you found yourself spending every hour that you weren't doing something else scrolling on your phone, investing all this time and effort, and it wasn't until you looked up one day and you realized, I just killed several hours doing nothing. Maybe that focal point was on something else entirely. Maybe it was on something that you just recognized far too late. This was the problem. It distracted me from what I should have been focused on this entire time. It took away my focus and my energy towards the one thing that I should have been giving all of my attention. For Peter, in our text today, this metaphor was a little more literal than what we would like it to be. When we last left Peter last week, everything was kind of crazy for him, right? We talked about this encounter that he had with Jesus that in the moment had to feel incredibly random, right? Peter's just out there, he's doing his fisherman thing, and all of a sudden Jesus just shows up and plops himself right on his boat and starts teaching. And after they finished this, after they'd had a whole night of just the worst fishing experience you can have because they caught nothing, Jesus says, hey, go ahead and cast out those nets one more time for me. And we talked about how even Peter didn't want to do it. He even said, I don't want to do this, but because you say so, I will. It resulted in the single greatest catch of fish of his entire career. To the point the nets were breaking, the boats were sinking, all that cool stuff. It was a random encounter, but it was a great encounter. But that encounter ended with Jesus saying, now follow me. We marveled at the idea that Peter left everything behind to go and follow after Jesus. And then the time span between where we left things off to where we are picking things up today in Matthew chapter 14. So if you want to get turned there, Matthew 14 is where we're going to be at today. In that time span from that first random encounter with Jesus until we get to here, Peter has seen Jesus do just incredible, dare I say, unbelievable things. See, already before we get to Matthew chapter 14, Peter has seen Jesus heal the sick. He has seen Jesus take somebody who has been blind from birth and make him able to see for the very first time. He's seen Jesus do all sorts of other incredible, impossible things, including, in one instance, he's seen Jesus raise the dead. I'm going to be honest with you. If there's one thing that Peter would have seen Jesus do that had to be maybe the most unnerving, I would have to say it's probably raising the dead, right? We understand that death is the end, right? I don't know about you. I've been in the room as somebody has taken their last breath. It is an unnerving feeling to recognize that one moment ago that person was alive, now they're not. To see that at one point in time this person was living and breathing, and now everything has stopped. They're not there anymore. And for Peter, having seen a person who has passed that moment suddenly come back to life, that had to be unnerving, had to be uncomfortable. But it also had to be pretty awe-inspiring, right? And that's still just scratching the surface. I mean, he's seen Jesus cast out demons. He saw him tell the storm to stop it, and it stopped it. Could you imagine that? We had a really windy day yesterday, and I was trying to smoke some turkey out in my smoker. And I said, "Hey, knock it off." It didn't stop. But it'd have been super weird if it did, right? I'd have been like, whoa. I've offended my wife. She's leaving. So. But it's an unusual thing to see this sort of thing take place. And yet for Peter, he is seeing his new friend Jesus do this all the time. The year that Peter has already spent with Jesus, likely by the time we get to chapter 14, has been a year that he never would have thought for himself. It would have been completely crazy. And in fact, before we get to this particular passage that we're going to be at today, Peter has once again seen Jesus do something crazy. He's seen him feed 5,000 people, likely more, with a small lunch. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but at a certain point, as I read through the gospel narratives over and over again, I got to think, like, when they get to the feeding of the 5,000, at a certain point, does this become kind of ho-hum for the disciples? Like everybody else in that crowd is going, whoa, did you see what Jesus did? And Peter and the other disciples are like, yeah, it's Tuesday. We kind of expect this. But there's still just that awe and that wonder of all the things that Peter has had a front row seat for. He's heard every sermon. He's hung on every single word that has come out of Jesus' mouth. He has marveled at the parables that Jesus has said, even though most of the time he doesn't quite get them. He is still so excited about everything that Jesus is doing. But in spite of everything that he has seen Jesus do, by the time we get to our text today, Matthew chapter 14, everything doesn't make sense. This particular narrative does not make a whole lot of sense to him. See, after Jesus had finished feeding this great multitude of people, he tells Peter and the other disciples, hey, go ahead and move on to the next point. I'll catch up with you. And we might sit there and we might wonder, why is Jesus doing this? But if you think back to when we talked about that particular narrative, feeding the 5,000, Jesus was in a remote place. That's why they had to feed the 5,000. Well, why was he in the remote place? Because he was trying to get away and mourn the passing of his friend John. And so likely the reason why Jesus is sending the disciples onto this boat and telling them to go on ahead of me is so he can finally have that quiet moment to himself. It's not an unusual thing for Jesus to want to have moments to himself. Peter's kind of used to this. Every now and again, Jesus just wants to go off on his own, and that's fine. So he sends the disciples, he gets them into the boat, he puts them on the water and says, I'll catch up with you. But I noticed something in that particular text. Jesus never tells them where they're going. I'll catch up with you. Cool, where are we going? Don't worry about it. Weird. And Jesus has been gone for a while now, and Peter's starting to recognize we're out in the middle of nowhere on this water. There's not a lot going on around us. It's starting to get dark. And the water is starting to get choppy. In fact, we find out in verse, verse 24, it actually says in the last part of verse 24 that the boat that they were in was being beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. The water is getting restless. It's getting dark. We're in the middle of nowhere. We don't know where we're supposed to go, and we don't know where Jesus is. All of this is kind of creating a unusual situation for these disciples. They've seen Jesus do impossible things, yes, but this feels different. They're alone. Their leader is not with them. He's not going to be there to calm these waters. The wind is picking up. The waves are getting rocky. And again, it's getting dark. And so I can imagine that Peter and the other disciples are more than a little freaked out by what happens next. Here they are in the middle of this water, and this rough water, and this dark water. And all of a sudden they see something in the distance that kind of looks like a person. Imagine Peter, even this experienced fisherman who probably grew up on the water, who probably knows how to handle a boat in any and all situations. He is seeing this being walking towards them, and he's got to be thinking, my eyes are just playing tricks on me, right? So he rubs them really, really hard, and then he starts blinking away, and it's still there. If I didn't know any better, it looks like it's coming right for us. One of the other disciples, because there's no way this was Peter. There's just no chance of that. And verse 26 actually says this: when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. Thanks, Matt. And they said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. Now, I don't know how you like to picture this particular part of the narrative. Right? Like our brains always tend to play movies for us about how these things go. We like to fill in the gaps. For me, I like to picture it like it's Scooby-Doo. It's a ghost! Jinkies! Did anybody who grew up in the 60s and 70s, did you guys actually say jinkies? Was that a real thing? Okay, cool. Thanks for that confirmation. That's just how I like to picture it. Something about grown men standing there screaming because they think they're seeing a ghost just tickles me. And so they are terrified about what is happening here. They don't know what's going to happen, but then it somehow gets worse, right? Again, it's dark. The water's choppy. We're in the middle of nowhere. This is all the makings of a really great horror movie. And they're terrified that now they think it's a ghost. And then to top it all off, this specter that is coming towards them. And I don't know what you know about buoyancy, but people aren't supposed to be able to walk on water. This specter walking towards them that they are all thinking is a ghost hollers out to them and essentially says, "Hey guys, don't worry, it's just me." Peter's not 100% sure, but that sounds a little like Jesus. But he can't be walking on the water. That's impossible. And so he kind of processes this thing a little bit more like, I've seen Jesus do crazy stuff, but this one defies everything I understand about water. Maybe it's him, but I'm not so sure. You know what? I need to come up with a test for this. And I'm going to be honest with you. The test that Peter winds up coming up with here is not one that I would have thought of, right? I would have probably said, well, hey, if you're Jesus, what's the joke that Andrew said at the campfire last night? Hey, what did we eat for dinner at that one restaurant last week? If you're really Jesus, tell me something only Jesus would know. That's the kind of stuff that I would come up with. But I'm not Peter. See, we've talked about this with fishermen before, that fishermen tended not to be the best and the brightest. Right? Typically, if you were a fisherman, it was because of one or two reasons. One, either your family had a fishing business that they've had for generations and it was expected and anticipated you'd be the one to take it over. The other reason, well, you were just too dumb for anything else. We don't really know which one Peter is, but I think I've got a good idea based on his reaction of what he tells this particular potential ghost out there on the water. It says there in verse 28, it's Peter's brilliant idea. Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Here's the thing. I've seen a lot of ghost movies before. And I have yet to see all but maybe one ghost movie where the ghost was friendly. I like Casper. He's a friendly ghost. But if most of the other ghosts that I've seen on film or read in books and all that stuff, they tend to be pretty murderous, if you will. And so if this is a ghost, what's to stop him from saying, "Sure, it's me, Jesus, come on out," just to watch Peter drown? I got to think that there's at least one of the other 11 who just looks at Peter and says, "Dude, that's the best you got?" But Peter has come up with this idea of, if it's Jesus, tell me to come out there. And sure enough, he's going to have to put his money where his mouth is. The first part of verse 29 tells us this unknown figure that just a moment ago they all thought for sure was a ghost, but now it's claiming to be Jesus, calls Peter out, because it says in the first part of verse 29, he said, "Come." Can you hear it? If you listen just close enough, you can hear the... Because now Peter's been called out. Now he's got to actually put his money where his mouth is. This thing that he thought a moment ago was a ghost, but now he's maybe starting to believe, certainly he's hoping, that this is his master and his teacher has just called him to step out of the boat. I have to imagine that Peter, as he's realizing what's happening and as he's realizing this is going to have to take place, that he's going to have to show himself up, he's not taking his eyes off of this person, off of this thing, off of whatever. He's starting to believe that this could be Jesus, right? Because Jesus would tell him to do this. So as he gets out of the boat, as he puts his foot down on the water, he's not breaking eye contact. He is focused wholeheartedly on who he is starting to believe to be is Jesus. To the point that he doesn't even realize it. But he's walking where he shouldn't be. Peter, this ordinary dude, is doing the impossible. All of his focus and attention is solely placed on Jesus. And now he's walking on water. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the other 11 watching all this taking place? Right? Simon the Zealot's got to pick his jaw up off the floor. Their eyes are bugged out of their head, watching as their friend is doing something that he should not be able to do. But it doesn't last. Oh, it'd be so cool if it did. It would have been so cool if the story ends with Peter goes all the way to Jesus and the two of them lock arms and skip their way on the water back to the boat. That's not what happens. Because at a certain point, Peter breaks eye contact. Maybe the wind rushes by it just the right way, or maybe a wave crashes up against him to the point that maybe the water hits his knee and it's cold enough that it breaks his concentration, and all of a sudden he begins to notice the winds and the waves. He lost sight of his focal point, and it's about to cost him. Because as soon as he notices those winds and those waves, as soon as he sees these things that just a moment ago he was terrified of, all of a sudden that fear creeps its way back in. And once it does, he starts to sink into the water. This is about to go from one of the coolest moments ever to maybe the end of Peter's story. He cries out, begging that Jesus come and save him. It says in verse 30, when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Took his eyes off Jesus. He lost sight of his focal point. And the winds and the waves suddenly became far more important to him. They overshadowed his main focus. And it caused him to sink. Jesus catches him and he pulls him up. And he asks him a really interesting question. It says in verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, Why did you doubt? Why did you take your eyes off of me? You were doing it. You were doing so great. Why'd you doubt? You saw that you could do it. Why'd you stop believing that? Why did you take your focus off of me? I don't know about you. I've heard, probably 100 sermons on this particular text. Maybe more. Right? It's one of those moments in the scriptures that we marvel at. And every preacher I've ever heard preach on this particular text, they take one of two directions with how they decide to land the ship. That's the technical term. You're welcome. They either spend their time marveling at how Jesus was able to walk on the water, which itself is fantastic. Do not lose sight of that. But it's Jesus, right? Almost every story that we have of Jesus that's in the Gospels is of him doing something that we should not be able to do. Or, and probably more frequently, they focus on how the story ends. They talk about Peter doubting. And I've heard some preachers drag Peter through the mud there and talking about that doubt and talking about how he didn't do this. But we do that to the point that we lose sight that for a moment, when Peter's focus was exactly where it needed to be, he did the impossible. Right? Peter's not Jesus. We're going to talk some more stories about Peter throughout this whole series where you're going to see very clearly Peter ain't Jesus. He should not be able to walk on the water, and yet he did. For a moment, but he still did. How? Because for that moment, his undivided focus was on Jesus. It wasn't on the winds and the waves. And here's the crazy part about this, and I'll be honest with you, this didn't dawn on me till this morning as I was thinking about what we're going to talk about here. Those winds and waves were there before. They were there before Jesus said, "Come on out." Peter knew they were there. For just a moment, he was able to focus everything he had on Jesus. And for just that moment, Peter did the impossible. His faith in Christ was so great that he was able to do something that under normal circumstances and in just a moment afterwards, he was no longer able to do. It makes you wonder where our focus is. See, I'm going to guess that most of you in this room are probably a lot like me, right? You've had those moments in your life, and you're probably talking about them right now in your own brain, saying, "Brandon, you don't understand. I have tried over and over again. I have tried as hard as I can to make Jesus the focus of my life, but it just seems like everything gets in the way." Yeah, the winds and the waves were there before. Yet we doubt. Every moment. Just as guilty, right here. Because there's not been a real moment in my life where I can honestly say that my focus with Jesus has been so intense that I've been able to do the impossible, even for just a moment. So where's our focus? Maybe you have tried. Maybe you have given it your honest to goodness attempt, but you've just found yourself constantly sinking. You've found yourself just crashed in on the winds and the waves of life, the proverbial things. And they take you by surprise, and even if for just a half a second you're able to put that focus on Jesus, that next half of that second, the car breaks down. The washing machine just stops. Whatever the situation is, it just takes your attention and your focus away from that. Because all of a sudden that becomes the most important thing, doesn't it? I hate that about myself. At the instant that anything goes even remotely wrong, I blow it up out of proportion. And in the process, I've lost my focus from where it should be. If as a church, for just a moment even, we can have that undivided focus squarely on where it should be at all times, on Jesus and chasing after Him and what He wants and the direction that He wants this church to go, I gotta be honest with you, I think we're going to see the impossible. So where's our focus? But here's the thing, and I find this inescapable about this particular narrative. As cool a story as this is, Jesus walking on the water and inviting Peter to do the same, and Peter doing it for just that moment because his focus is on the right spot. There were 11 other dudes in this story. 11 other guys. Not a one of them tried to step out. I think by and large, for most Christians, we like the boat. We want to stay safe. We want to stay where we have some stability. Yeah, we're still being battered by the winds and the waves, but if we stay right here, and if we don't go anywhere else, if we stay safe in our churches, if we stay safe in our little bunkers right there, and we don't engage and we don't go outside, we're going to be fine. Again, I've heard a lot of sermons where I've seen some very eloquent preachers drag Peter through the mud because of that moment of doubt. But man, at least he was able to get out of the boat. At least he was willing to try. Because a faith that is untested, can we really call that a faith? A faith that is unwilling to do and try and make an effort and go to those uncomfortable spots, can we call that a faith? What are we truly having our faith in? I'm going to challenge you today. It's a hard one. Get out of the boat. Try. Make an effort. I'll be honest with you. You'll probably sink. Make an effort. Give it a shot. Be willing to try something new and different and maybe just a little bit scary. Talk to that friend about Jesus. Go to that place where those people are that make you a little bit nervous and you're not sure about it, and tell them about your Savior. Invite somebody to church. Get out of the boat. Just make sure your focus is on the right spot when you do. Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, and we'll close with it today. He said, if you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Love this. Set your minds on the things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died. Your life is hidden with Christ in God.